Question 1. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to ensure thoroughness in the review process for Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit applications. An applicant has disclosed a past arrest for assault, which did not result in a conviction. How should an official responsible for reviewing this application proceed to ensure compliance with Montana's regulatory framework and ethical obligations? Option A. Immediately deny the permit application based on the disclosure of the arrest, regardless of the lack of a conviction, to err on the side of caution. Option B. Seek out and consider unsubstantiated rumors or information from informal sources regarding the applicant's past behavior to inform the decision. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of all provided documentation and legally accessible public records relevant to the applicant's history, assessing the disclosed arrest against Montana's specific disqualifying criteria for concealed weapon permits. Option D. Approve the permit application without further investigation, assuming that an arrest without a conviction is not a disqualifying factor under Montana law. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive review of all provided documentation and legally accessible public records relevant to the applicant's history, assessing the disclosed arrest against Montana's specific disqualifying criteria for concealed weapon permits. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the applicant's right to privacy and the need for thorough due diligence with the potential risks associated with issuing a concealed weapon permit. The applicant's past behavior, even if not resulting in a conviction, raises concerns about their suitability and adherence to Montana's laws regarding firearm possession and public safety. A hasty decision could compromise public safety, while an overly cautious or biased approach could unfairly deny a permit. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing interests ethically and legally. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive review of all provided documentation, including the applicant's self-disclosure and any available public records or reports that are legally accessible and relevant to the permit application under Montana law. This approach prioritizes a fact-based assessment, adhering to the principle of due process and the specific requirements outlined in Montana's statutes governing concealed weapon permits. It ensures that the decision is grounded in objective criteria and legal standards, rather than assumptions or personal biases. This aligns with the ethical obligation to act impartially and to uphold the integrity of the permitting process, ensuring that only qualified individuals receive permits while respecting individual rights. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately deny the permit based solely on the applicant's self-disclosure of a past arrest without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge that an arrest is not a conviction, and that Montana law likely requires a more nuanced assessment of the circumstances and the applicant's subsequent conduct. It bypasses the due diligence required to determine if the arrest is legally disqualifying under Montana's specific criteria for concealed weapon permits. Another incorrect approach is to approve the permit without any further consideration of the self-disclosed arrest, assuming that if it wasn't a conviction, it's irrelevant. This ignores the potential implications of the arrest on the applicant's judgment, temperament, or propensity for violence, which are often implicit considerations in firearm permitting processes. It neglects the responsibility to ensure public safety by not adequately assessing the applicant's overall suitability. A third incorrect approach is to seek out and consider information that is not legally permissible or relevant to the concealed weapon permit application under Montana law, such as unsubstantiated rumors or information from sources outside official channels. This violates privacy rights and introduces potential bias into the decision-making process, undermining the fairness and legality of the review. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a structured decision-making process. First, thoroughly understand the specific legal requirements and disqualifying factors for a Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit. Second, meticulously review all submitted application materials, paying close attention to any disclosures that may indicate potential risks. Third, conduct legally permissible and relevant background checks to corroborate or clarify disclosed information. Fourth, assess the gathered information against the established legal criteria, focusing on objective facts and avoiding personal opinions or biases. Finally, document the decision-making process clearly and comprehensively, justifying the outcome based on the applicable Montana statutes and regulations. Question 2. System analysis indicates a situation where an individual involved in the Montana concealed weapon permit application process has a close personal friend applying for a permit. The applicant has asked this individual for assistance in navigating the application, implying a desire for preferential treatment or expedited processing due to their friendship. What is the most ethically and regulatorily sound approach for the individual to take? Option A. Offer to help the applicant by reviewing their application to ensure it is complete, subtly guiding them through any potential issues without explicitly stating it's due to their friendship. Option B. Immediately process the application with extra diligence and speed, ensuring it is approved quickly to demonstrate goodwill to the friend. Option C. Lightly decline to assist the applicant, clearly explaining that due to the personal relationship, providing any assistance would be inappropriate and could compromise the integrity of the application process, and advise them to follow the standard application procedures. Option D. Inform the applicant that, while direct assistance is not possible, they can provide general information about the permit requirements without engaging in any specific review of their application. The correct answer is C. Politely decline to assist the applicant, clearly explaining that due to the personal relationship, providing any assistance would be inappropriate and could compromise the integrity of the application process, and advise them to follow the standard application procedures. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a personal relationship and the strict requirements of maintaining impartiality and adhering to the Montana Personal and Family Protection Act concerning concealed weapon permits. The applicant's request, while seemingly minor, touches upon the integrity of the permitting process and the duty to uphold the law without bias. Careful judgment is required to navigate this situation ethically and legally. The best professional approach involves a direct and transparent communication with the applicant, clearly stating the inability to provide assistance due to the personal relationship and the legal prohibition against such preferential treatment under Montana law. This approach is correct because it upholds the principle of impartiality, which is fundamental to the fair administration of any legal process, including the issuance of concealed weapon permits. Specifically, Montana law, while not explicitly detailing familial conflicts in permit processing, operates under the general legal and ethical framework that public officials and those involved in administrative processes must avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of impropriety. By declining to assist and explaining the reason based on the personal relationship, the individual acts in accordance with the spirit and intent of laws, designed to ensure fairness and prevent undue influence. This also aligns with the ethical obligation to treat all applicants equally and to avoid any action that could be construed as favoritism. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with assisting the applicant, perhaps by overlooking minor discrepancies or expediting the process due to the personal connection. This is ethically and regulatorily flawed because it compromises the integrity of the permitting process. It violates the principle of equal treatment under the law and creates an appearance of impropriety, which can erode public trust in the system. Such actions could be seen as a breach of duty and potentially lead to legal challenges or disciplinary action. Another incorrect approach would be to refuse assistance without providing a clear and professional explanation, leaving the applicant confused or feeling unfairly treated. While avoiding direct assistance is correct, a complete lack of professional communication can be detrimental. It fails to educate the applicant on the boundaries of the professional role and the importance of impartiality, and it misses an opportunity to reinforce the integrity of the process. A further incorrect approach would be to attempt to find a loophole or an indirect way to help the applicant without explicitly violating a written rule, while still leveraging the personal relationship. This is ethically unsound, as it still involves acting on a personal connection rather than solely on the merits of the application and the established legal criteria. It skirts the edges of ethical conduct and can still lead to an appearance of favoritism, undermining the fairness of the process. Professionals in such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, impartiality, and adherence to legal and ethical standards. This involves 1. Identifying the potential conflict of interest or appearance of impropriety. 2. Consulting relevant laws and ethical guidelines, in this case, Montana's Personal and Family Protection Act and general principles of administrative law and ethics. 3. Communicating clearly and professionally with the applicant explaining the limitations imposed by the personal relationship and the legal framework. 4. Declining to provide any assistance that could be perceived as preferential treatment. 5. Documenting the interaction and the decision made. Question 3. Stakeholder feedback indicates that some Montana concealed weapon permit instructors have encountered students who make concerning statements about their intentions for carrying a concealed weapon, such as expressing a desire to settle scores or be ready for anything. Given these circumstances, what is the most professionally responsible course of action for an instructor to take when a student makes such remarks during a required training course in Montana? Option A. Report the student's statements to law enforcement immediately without attempting to address the issue directly with the student or assess their intent further. Option B. Engage the student in a direct conversation to understand the context of their statements, reinforce the legal and ethical responsibilities of carrying a concealed weapon in Montana, and assess their genuine intent and understanding of safe and lawful firearm use. Option C. Ignore the student's statements, assuming they are hypothetical or not indicative of actual intent, and proceed with certifying them for the permit if they otherwise meet the course requirements. Option D. Immediately refuse to certify the student and dismiss them from the course solely based on the concerning statements, without further discussion or assessment of their intent. Correct answer is B. Engage the student in a direct conversation to understand the context of their statements, reinforce the legal and ethical responsibilities of carrying a concealed weapon in Montana, and assess their genuine intent and understanding of safe and lawful firearm use. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Montana concealed weapon permit instructor due to a conflict between a student's stated intent and the instructor's ethical obligations and legal responsibilities under Montana law. The instructor must balance the right to bear arms with the responsibility to ensure permits are issued only to individuals who meet legal and safety requirements and who do not pose a demonstrable risk. This requires careful judgment to avoid both enabling potential misuse of a permit and unfairly denying a lawful right. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves directly addressing the student's concerning statements and assessing their intent and understanding of responsible firearm ownership and the legal implications of carrying a concealed weapon in Montana. This approach prioritizes safety and legal compliance by engaging the student in a dialogue to understand the context of their statements, reinforcing the legal requirements for permit holders, and determining if the student genuinely understands and intends to abide by Montana's laws regarding concealed carry. If the student's statements indicate a clear intent to use the weapon unlawfully or irresponsibly, or if they demonstrate a lack of understanding of legal responsibilities, the instructor has a professional and ethical duty to refuse to certify them for the permit, as per Montana's statutory requirements for permit issuance, which implicitly require responsible intent. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to ignore the student's statements, assuming they are merely hypothetical or bravado, and proceed with certification. This fails to uphold the instructor's duty to ensure permit applicants are suitable and understand the gravity of carrying a concealed weapon. It risks certifying an individual who may pose a danger to themselves or others, violating the spirit and intent of Montana's concealed weapon permit laws. Another incorrect approach is to immediately dismiss the student and refuse certification solely based on the concerning statements without further inquiry. While the statements are alarming, Montana law requires a basis for denial beyond mere suspicion. A professional instructor should first attempt to understand the student's intent and provide education on responsible carry. This approach prematurely denies a lawful right without due process or a thorough assessment of the individual's actual intent and understanding. A third incorrect approach is to report the student to law enforcement without first attempting to address the issue directly with the student. While reporting may be necessary if the student expresses an immediate threat, it bypasses the instructor's role in education and assessment. The instructor's primary responsibility in this context is to assess the student's suitability for a permit based on their understanding and intent, and to provide guidance. Escalating to law enforcement without this initial step is an overreaction that may not be warranted and could unfairly stigmatize the student. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that begins with active listening and open communication. When faced with concerning statements, the first step is to seek clarification and understand the context. This should be followed by an assessment of the individual's understanding of legal responsibilities and ethical considerations related to firearm ownership and concealed carry. If the assessment reveals a genuine risk or a clear intent to misuse the permit, then appropriate actions, including refusal of certification or reporting to authorities if an immediate threat is perceived, should be taken. This process ensures that decisions are based on a thorough evaluation rather than assumptions or premature reactions, upholding both legal requirements and ethical standards. Question 4. Stakeholder feedback indicates a concern regarding the thoroughness of the review process for Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit applications. An applicant, who previously worked as a private security guard in another state, has submitted a complete application that appears to meet all standard requirements. However, the reviewing officer has a vague, unverified concern that the applicant's past profession might imply a predisposition to aggressive behavior. What is the most appropriate course of action for the reviewing officer? Option A. Contact the applicant's former employer to solicit opinions on the applicant's temperament and suitability for carrying a concealed weapon beyond what is required by Montana law. Option B. Issue the permit immediately without a detailed review, assuming that a complete application automatically signifies eligibility. Option C. Review the application strictly against the criteria outlined in Montana Code, annotated Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, and issue the permit if all statutory requirements are met and no disqualifying factors are present. Option D. Deny the permit based on the subjective concern that the applicant's past profession as a security guard might indicate a predisposition to aggressive behavior, even if no specific disqualifying factor is identified in the statute. The correct answer is C. Review the application strictly against the criteria outlined in Montana Code, annotated Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, and issue the permit if all statutory requirements are met and no disqualifying factors are present. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the applicant's stated intent with the legal requirements for obtaining a Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit, while also navigating potential ethical concerns regarding the applicant's past behavior and the implications for public safety. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Montana law without unfairly prejudicing the applicant. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of the applicant's submitted documentation against the specific criteria outlined in Montana Code, annotated MCA Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, which governs concealed weapon permits. This includes verifying residency requirements for non-residents, confirming the applicant has met the age and training prerequisites, and ensuring no disqualifying factors are present as defined by MCA 45-8-302. If the application appears complete and compliant on its face, and no immediate red flags are apparent that would trigger further investigation under MCA 45-8-301, the permit should be issued. This approach adheres strictly to the statutory framework, treating the applicant based on the information provided and the established legal criteria, thereby upholding due process and avoiding arbitrary denial. An incorrect approach would be to deny the permit solely based on a subjective interpretation of the applicant's past employment as a security guard, without concrete evidence that this employment history constitutes a disqualifying factor under Montana law. MCA 45-8-302 lists specific disqualifications such as felony convictions, certain misdemeanor convictions, or being subject to a restraining order. A past profession without more does not fall into these categories. This approach fails to follow the established legal standards and introduces an element of personal bias, which is ethically unsound and legally indefensible. Another incorrect approach would be to issue the permit immediately without a proper review of the application against the statutory requirements. This bypasses the mandated due diligence process, potentially compromising public safety if the applicant were to be disqualified for reasons not immediately apparent but discoverable through a proper review. It also undermines the integrity of the permitting system. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to contact the applicant's former employer for subjective opinions on their character or suitability to carry a concealed weapon. Montana law does not mandate or permit such inquiries for the purpose of assessing character beyond the specific disqualifications listed in the statute. This action exceeds the legal authority granted to the permitting authority and infringes on the applicant's privacy without a legal basis. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to the specific statutes and regulations of Montana. This involves a systematic review of all submitted documentation against defined legal criteria, a commitment to objective assessment, and a clear understanding of the grounds for both approval and denial as stipulated by law. When faced with ambiguity or potential concerns, the framework should include established procedures for seeking clarification or conducting further investigation within the bounds of legal authority, rather than relying on subjective judgment or extraneous information. Question 5. Benchmark analysis indicates a Montana licensed firearms instructor has received an inquiry from an out-of-state resident who wishes to obtain a Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit. The applicant expresses concern about the time it takes to process the permit and asks if there is a way to speed things up or bypass certain steps, implying a willingness to pay extra for expedited service or unofficial assistance. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant response for the instructor? Option A. Agree to accept the applicant's application materials and submit them to the relevant authorities on their behalf, assuring them that you will personally follow up to ensure a quick turnaround. Option B. Suggest that the applicant explore obtaining a permit in their home state first, as Montana's process may be too cumbersome for their needs. Option C. Politely inform the applicant that all applicants, including non-residents, must strictly adhere to the official application process as mandated by Montana law, which includes submitting the required forms and undergoing all necessary background checks, and that no unofficial expedited services are available. Option D. Advise the applicant on specific information they might be able to omit from their application to expedite the review process, while still submitting the official forms. Correct answer is C. Politely inform the applicant that all applicants, including non-residents, must strictly adhere to the official application process as mandated by Montana law, which includes submitting the required forms and undergoing all necessary background checks, and that no unofficial expedited services are available. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Montana licensed firearms instructor when a prospective out-of-state applicant for a Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit inquires about circumventing standard application procedures. The challenge lies in balancing the applicant's desire for expediency with the instructor's ethical and legal obligations to uphold Montana's concealed weapon permit laws. Failure to adhere to these laws could result in severe penalties for both the applicant and the instructor, including the denial of the permit, criminal charges, and revocation of the instructor's license. Careful judgment is required to navigate this situation ethically and legally. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves politely but firmly informing the applicant that Montana law requires all applicants, including non-residents, to follow the established application process as outlined by the Montana Department of Justice. This includes completing the required application form, undergoing a background check, and meeting all other statutory requirements. This approach is correct because it directly upholds Montana Code Annotated, MCA Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, which governs concealed weapon permits. Specifically, MCA 45-8-302 mandates that the Attorney General shall issue permits to qualified applicants, implying a standardized and legally defined process for all. Providing false information or attempting to bypass these procedures is a violation of MCA 45-8-308, which addresses false statements. By adhering to the law, the instructor acts ethically by promoting responsible firearm ownership and preventing potential legal ramifications for both parties. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to suggest or facilitate any method that bypasses the official application process, such as offering to expedite the application through unofficial channels, or advising the applicant on how to omit or misrepresent information on the application. This is ethically and legally unacceptable, as it directly violates Montana's concealed weapon permit statutes, potentially constituting aiding and abetting a violation of law. It undermines the integrity of the permitting system designed to ensure public safety and could lead to the issuance of permits to individuals who do not meet the legal qualifications. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the applicant's inquiry without providing any guidance on the correct procedure. while not actively facilitating a violation. This approach fails to uphold the instructor's professional responsibility to educate and guide individuals seeking to comply with Montana law. It misses an opportunity to ensure the applicant understands the legal requirements and may leave the applicant to pursue improper methods out of ignorance. A third incorrect approach is to agree to accept the application materials directly and submit them on behalf of the applicant, without ensuring all official requirements are met, and that the applicant understands their personal responsibility in the application process. This could inadvertently lead to the submission of incomplete or inaccurate information, placing the instructor in a position of potential liability, and failing to ensure the applicant has personally attested the truthfulness of their application as required by law. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct. When faced with inquiries that suggest a desire to circumvent established procedures, the first step is to identify the relevant statutes and regulations governing the situation. In this case, Montana's concealed weapon permit laws are paramount. The professional should then clearly and respectfully communicate the legal requirements to the inquirer, emphasizing the importance of following the official process. If the inquirer persists in seeking improper shortcuts, the professional must decline to assist in any way that violates the law and, if appropriate, document the interaction. This framework ensures that decisions are grounded in legal authority and ethical principles, protecting both the professional and the public interest. Question 6. Stakeholder feedback indicates a concern regarding the responsible exercise of rights by Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit holders. A permit holder, legally carrying a concealed firearm under their Montana permit, enters a private retail establishment in Montana. Upon entering, they observe clear signage at the entrance stating "No firearms allowed." The establishment's owner, noticing the permit holder, approaches and verbally reiterates the policy, asking the permit holder to leave the firearm outside or depart the premises. What is the most ethically and legally sound course of action for the permit holder? Option A. Proceed with their shopping, asserting their right to carry as granted by the Montana permit, and consider the signage and verbal request as an infringement on their rights. Option B. Politely inform the owner that their Montana concealed weapon permit legally allows them to carry a firearm, and that the signage and verbal request are invalid. Option C. Conceal the firearm more effectively and continue shopping, believing that as long as the firearm remains concealed, the owner's request is not applicable. Option D. Respect the private property owner's request and either secure the firearm appropriately outside the establishment or leave the premises, understanding that private property owners have the right to set rules for their establishments. The correct answer is D. Respect the private property owner's request and either secure the firearm appropriately outside the establishment or leave the premises, understanding that private property owners have the right to set rules for their establishments. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a permit holder's right to carry and the potential for that right to be exercised in a manner that could cause public alarm or violate the spirit of responsible firearm ownership, even if technically within the letter of the law. The challenge lies in balancing individual rights with public safety concerns and maintaining the integrity of the concealed weapon permit system in Montana. Careful judgment is required to navigate the nuances of responsible permit holder conduct. The best professional approach involves prioritizing adherence to the explicit terms and conditions of the Montana concealed weapon permit and understanding the underlying intent of the law, which is to allow for lawful self-defense while minimizing public apprehension. This means recognizing that, while the permit may allow carrying in certain locations, the permit holder has an ethical responsibility to consider the context and potential impact of their actions on others. If a business owner or establishment explicitly prohibits firearms on their private property, even if state law permits carrying in that general area, a permit holder should respect that prohibition to avoid creating a conflict and to uphold the principle of respecting private property rights. This approach aligns with the ethical obligation of responsible firearm ownership and demonstrates respect for the rights of private property owners. An incorrect approach would be to assert the right to carry based solely on the permit, disregarding the explicit signage or verbal request of a private property owner. This fails to acknowledge the property owner's right to control their premises and can lead to unnecessary confrontation, potentially jeopardizing the permit holder's privilege and undermining public trust in permit holders. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because the permit is valid, all locations are permissible, without considering the specific rules of private establishments. This demonstrates a lack of situational awareness and an incomplete understanding of the responsibilities that accompany a concealed weapon permit. Finally, an approach that involves carrying the weapon openly in defiance of a private establishment's policy, even if the permit is for concealed carry, is a clear violation of the spirit of concealed carry and demonstrates poor judgment and a disregard for the property owner's wishes. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that involves 1. Understanding the explicit legal requirements of their permit and the relevant state laws. Montana. 2. Recognizing the rights of private property owners to set rules for their establishments. 3. Assessing the specific context and potential for conflict. And 4. Acting in a manner that upholds both their rights and responsibilities, prioritizing de-escalation and respect for others' property. Question 7. Strategic planning requires a Montana resident applying for a non-resident concealed weapon permit to navigate the specific legal landscape of Montana. If an applicant has a past misdemeanor conviction in their home state that was later expunged, but Montana law, as outlined in the Montana Code Annotated, lists such convictions as disqualifying for a concealed weapon permit, what is the most ethically sound and legally compliant course of action for the applicant? Option A. Omit the expunged misdemeanor conviction from the application, assuming that expungement in another state negates its relevance for a Montana permit. Option B. Assume that because the conviction is expunged, it is no longer a disqualifying factor and proceed with the application without further disclosure. Option C. Fully disclose the expunged misdemeanor conviction on the permit application and provide any supporting documentation, seeking clarification from the Montana Department of Justice regarding its impact on eligibility. Option D. Rely on the advice of a friend who also has a concealed weapon permit in Montana and believes expunged records are irrelevant for non-resident permits. The correct answer is C. Fully disclose the expunged misdemeanor conviction on the permit application and provide any supporting documentation, seeking clarification from the Montana Department of Justice regarding its impact on eligibility. Explanation. Strategic planning requires careful consideration of ethical implications, especially when dealing with sensitive legal matters such as obtaining a non-resident concealed weapon permit in Montana. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves navigating the legal requirements of a state while potentially having personal beliefs or circumstances that could create a conflict of interest or raise questions about the applicant's suitability. The applicant must balance their right to self-defense with the responsibility to adhere strictly to Montana's laws and regulations governing concealed carry. Misinterpreting or intentionally circumventing these laws can lead to severe legal consequences and undermine public trust in the permitting process. The best professional approach involves a thorough and honest self-assessment of eligibility according to Montana Code Annotated, MCA, Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, which governs concealed weapon permits. This includes verifying residency requirements, ensuring no disqualifying criminal history exists, and confirming the applicant meets all other statutory criteria. The applicant should proactively seek clarification from the Montana Department of Justice if any aspect of the eligibility criteria is unclear. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct by ensuring the applicant is genuinely qualified and acting in good faith. An incorrect approach would be to assume that holding a permit in another state automatically grants similar rights, or that personal interpretations of self-defense supersede specific state statutes. For instance, failing to disclose a past misdemeanor conviction that is disqualifying under MCA 45-8-321, even if it was expunged in another jurisdiction, represents a significant ethical and legal failure. This demonstrates a lack of candor and a disregard for Montana's specific legal framework. Another flawed approach is to rely on informal advice from non-official sources or to believe that a perceived threat justifies bypassing the application process. This ignores the due diligence required by MCA 45-8-321 and MCA 45-8-322, which mandate a thorough review of the applicant's background by the Department of Justice. Such actions undermine the integrity of the permitting system and can lead to the denial of the permit or criminal charges for providing false information. Professionals facing similar situations should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the relevant jurisdiction's laws and regulations. This involves consulting official government sources, seeking legal counsel if necessary, and conducting a complete and truthful self-assessment against all stated requirements. Transparency and honesty are paramount throughout the process. Question 8. The performance metrics show a significant backlog in processing non-resident concealed weapon permit applications in Montana. An applicant, Mr. Silas Blackwood, has submitted his application, and while he has no criminal record, his past membership in a group known for advocating civil disobedience has been flagged. How should the permit application be handled to ensure compliance with Montana law and ethical professional conduct? Option A. Contact the group Mr. Blackwood was associated with to gather information about his past activities and beliefs. Option B. Conduct a thorough, objective investigation into Mr. Blackwood's background, verifying all submitted documentation and investigating any potential disqualifying factors as defined by Montana law, and deny only if specific, legally defined disqualifying factors are found. Option C. Deny the application immediately due to Mr. Blackwood's past association with a group advocating civil disobedience, as this suggests a lack of good moral character. Option D. Approve the application without further investigation to reduce the backlog, assuming his lack of a criminal record is sufficient. Correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough, objective investigation into Mr. Blackwood's background, verifying all submitted documentation and investigating any potential disqualifying factors as defined by Montana law, and deny only if specific, legally defined disqualifying factors are found. Explanation. The performance metrics show a concerning trend in the processing of non-resident concealed weapon permit applications in Montana. A specific applicant, Mr. Silas Blackwood, has submitted an application that raises ethical questions due to his past association with a group known for advocating civil disobedience, even though he has no direct criminal record. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the applicant's right to apply for a permit with the state's responsibility to ensure public safety, all within the strict confines of Montana law regarding concealed weapon permits for non-residents. The challenge lies in interpreting good moral character and assessing potential risks without resorting to prejudice or unsubstantiated assumptions. The best professional approach involves a thorough, objective review of all submitted documentation and a diligent, lawful investigation into any potential disqualifying factors as defined by Montana Code Annotated, MCA, Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3. This includes verifying the applicant's residency status, ensuring all required documentation is present and accurate, and conducting a background check that adheres strictly to legal parameters. If the investigation uncovers information that directly contradicts the statutory requirements for good moral character, or poses a clear and present danger as defined by law, the application should be denied based on those specific, documented findings. This approach upholds due process, adheres to the letter of Montana law, and avoids subjective bias. An incorrect approach would be to deny the application solely based on Mr. Blackwood's association with a group advocating civil disobedience, without any evidence that he personally engaged in or advocated for illegal acts. This is ethically flawed as it punishes association rather than individual conduct and violates the principle of innocent until proven guilty. It also fails to meet the legal standard for denial, which requires specific disqualifying factors, not mere association with a potentially controversial group. Another incorrect approach would be to approve the application without any further investigation, despite the potentially concerning information about his past associations. This would be professionally negligent, as it fails to exercise due diligence in assessing whether the applicant meets the good moral character requirement, a crucial element for permit issuance under Montana law. It prioritizes expediency over public safety and adherence to regulatory standards. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to contact the group Mr. Blackwood was associated with to inquire about his past activities. This could violate privacy laws and potentially lead to the dissemination of unverified or biased information, creating an unfair basis for denial and potentially exposing the state to legal challenges. The investigation must remain within the bounds of legally permissible information gathering. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a commitment to objective fact-finding, strict adherence to the relevant statutory framework, in this case, Montana's concealed weapon permit laws, and a clear understanding of the ethical boundaries of investigation and decision-making. Professionals must distinguish between lawful associations and individual disqualifying conduct, ensuring that all decisions are based on concrete evidence and legal criteria, not on speculation or personal judgment. Question 9. Stakeholder feedback indicates a concern regarding the consistent and fair application of Montana's laws for non-resident concealed weapon permits. A specific applicant, who is otherwise qualified, has a past minor infraction that was resolved through a lawful process and is not listed as a disqualifying offense in Montana Code Annotated. How should a permit reviewer approach this application to ensure compliance with Montana's regulatory framework? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of all submitted documentation against the specific statutory requirements for non-resident concealed weapon permits in Montana, focusing solely on whether the applicant meets all legal criteria and has no disqualifying offenses as defined by Montana law. Option B. Expedite the approval of the permit without a complete verification of all required documentation. Assuming the applicant's past lawful resolution of the infraction implies overall good character. Option C. Deny the permit based on the applicant's past minor infraction, as a general indicator of potential future issues, even if it is not a statutorily disqualifying offense. Option D. Inform the applicant that their past infraction, regardless of its legal resolution, makes them an undesirable candidate for a concealed weapon permit in Montana and suggest they withdraw their application. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of all submitted documentation against the specific statutory requirements for non-resident concealed weapon permits in Montana, focusing solely on whether the applicant meets all legal criteria and has no disqualifying offenses as defined by Montana law. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the duty to uphold the law and public safety with the potential for personal bias or perceived unfairness. The applicant's past lawful conduct, even if it resulted in a minor infraction, could influence a reviewer's judgment, necessitating a commitment to objective evaluation. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the review process is fair, consistent, and strictly adheres to Montana's legal requirements for non-resident concealed weapon permits. The best professional approach involves a thorough and impartial review of the applicant's submitted documentation against the specific criteria outlined in Montana Code Annotated, MCA, Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, which governs concealed weapon permits. This includes verifying residency status, confirming the applicant meets the age and competency requirements, and ensuring no disqualifying factors are present as defined by Montana law. The reviewer must focus solely on whether the applicant meets the statutory requirements for a non-resident permit, without allowing personal opinions or past minor infractions of the applicant to sway the decision. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the legal mandate to grant permits based on objective, statutory criteria, thereby upholding the integrity of the permitting process and ensuring public safety through lawful means. An incorrect approach would be to deny the permit based on the applicant's past minor infraction, even if it was resolved lawfully. This fails to recognize that Montana law specifies disqualifying offenses, and a minor infraction, if not a disqualifying offense under MCA 45-8-302, should not be a basis for denial. This approach introduces an element of subjective judgment that is not permitted by statute and could lead to a legally challengeable decision. Another incorrect approach would be to grant the permit without a complete review of all required documentation, such as proof of residency or completion of a firearms safety course, if such a course is mandated for non-residents under Montana law. This bypasses essential legal requirements and compromises public safety by potentially issuing a permit to an unqualified individual. It violates the principle of due diligence and adherence to statutory mandates. A third incorrect approach would be to delay the decision indefinitely without a valid legal reason, hoping the applicant will withdraw their application. This is an unethical and unprofessional tactic that avoids the responsibility of making a decision based on the merits of the application and the law. It undermines the efficiency and fairness of the permitting process. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to the specific statutory requirements of Montana law. This involves a systematic review of all submitted evidence against each criterion outlined in the relevant MCA sections. If any doubt arises regarding an applicant's eligibility, the professional should seek clarification or further information as permitted by law, rather than making assumptions or applying personal biases. The ultimate goal is to ensure that every permit decision is legally sound, fair, and contributes to public safety. Question 10. Regulatory review indicates a non-resident applicant for a Montana concealed weapon permit has submitted a training certificate from their home state, which has different training hour requirements and a slightly varied curriculum compared to Montana's mandated course. What is the most appropriate method for assessing the equivalency of this out-of-state training? Option A. Reject the application outright, as the training hours and curriculum do not precisely match Montana's mandated course, regardless of content overlap. Option B. Compare the applicant's training certificate and course outline against the specific subject matter and minimum hour requirements outlined in Montana Code Annotated Section 45-3-312 to determine if all essential elements are covered. Option C. Automatically approve the application, assuming that any concealed weapon permit issued by another state signifies equivalent training as per Montana law. Option D. Accept the applicant's verbal assurance that their training covered all necessary topics, without requiring further documentation or verification. The correct answer is B. Compare the applicant's training certificate and course outline against the specific subject matter and minimum hour requirements outlined in Montana Code Annotated Section 45-3-312 to determine if all essential elements are covered. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge involving the interpretation and application of Montana's non-resident concealed weapon permit requirements, specifically concerning the reciprocity of training standards. The challenge lies in ensuring compliance with Montana law while acknowledging the varying training methodologies and durations across different states. A professional must navigate these differences to accurately assess the equivalency of out-of-state training without compromising safety or legal adherence. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a direct comparison of the applicant's out-of-state training certificate against the minimum training requirements stipulated by Montana law for concealed weapon permits. This requires identifying the specific hours and subject matter covered in the applicant's training and cross-referencing them with Montana Code Annotated MCA, Section 45-3-312. If the out-of-state training demonstrably covers all the essential elements mandated by Montana law, including firearm safety, legal aspects of carrying a concealed weapon, and the use of deadly force, then it should be considered equivalent. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to the statutory requirements of Montana, ensuring that all applicants, regardless of their state of origin, meet the same minimum competency and knowledge standards as required by the state. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to automatically accept any concealed weapon permit issued by another state as proof of equivalent training, without verifying the specific training content. This fails to comply with Montana law, which requires a review of the training itself, not just the existence of a permit from another jurisdiction. The law is concerned with the substance of the training, not merely the administrative act of issuing a permit. Another incorrect approach would be to reject any out-of-state training that does not precisely mirror the format or duration of Montana's mandated training, even if the content covers all the required subjects. This is overly rigid and fails to recognize that equivalent knowledge and skills can be acquired through different training programs. Montana law focuses on the outcome of the training, competency, and knowledge, not the specific pedagogical method. A further incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the applicant's self-assessment of their training's equivalency without independent verification. This introduces an unacceptable level of subjectivity and risk, as the applicant may not fully understand Montana's specific requirements or may misrepresent their training. Professional responsibility demands an objective assessment based on verifiable documentation and legal standards. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a systematic decision-making framework. First, they must thoroughly understand the specific legal requirements of Montana for concealed weapon permits, particularly MCA Section 45-3-312 regarding training. Second, they should establish clear criteria for evaluating out-of-state training, focusing on content and demonstrated competency rather than just the issuing state or permit status. Third, they should request and meticulously review all supporting documentation from the applicant, such as training certificates and course outlines. Finally, they must make a decision based on a direct comparison of the applicant's documented training against Montana's legal standards, ensuring fairness, consistency, and strict adherence to the law. Question 11. Performance analysis shows that a Montana resident who holds a valid concealed weapon permit issued by the state of Montana relocates to Idaho and wishes to continue carrying a concealed weapon legally. Which of the following actions represents the most prudent and legally compliant approach for this individual? Option A. Rely solely on information provided by Montana authorities regarding the validity of their concealed weapon permit in other states. Option B. Carry concealed without further verification, assuming Idaho law enforcement will recognize the valid Montana permit. Option C. Proactively research Idaho's laws and reciprocity agreements to determine the requirements for carrying a concealed weapon as a non-resident and take necessary steps to comply. Option D. Assume that the Montana concealed weapon permit is valid for concealed carry throughout Idaho due to interstate recognition principles. Correct answer is C. Proactively research Idaho's laws and reciprocity agreements to determine the requirements for carrying a concealed weapon as a non-resident and take necessary steps to comply. Explanation. Performance analysis shows that a Montana resident who has a valid concealed weapon permit issued by the state of Montana moves to Idaho and wishes to continue carrying a concealed weapon legally. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires understanding the nuances of interstate reciprocity for concealed weapon permits, which is not automatically guaranteed and depends on agreements between states. Careful judgment is required to ensure the individual remains compliant with the laws of both states. The correct approach involves the individual proactively researching and understanding Idaho's laws regarding concealed carry for non-residents. This means determining if Idaho recognizes Montana permits, and if not, what steps are necessary to obtain legal recognition or a permit in Idaho. This is the best professional practice because Montana's permit is only valid within Montana and for recognized reciprocity agreements. Idaho law dictates the requirements for carrying a concealed weapon within its borders. The individual must adhere to Idaho's specific statutes, which may include applying for an Idaho permit or confirming that a formal reciprocity agreement exists that covers their Montana permit. This proactive research ensures compliance with Idaho Code Title 18, Chapter 33, which governs firearms and weapons. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a valid Montana permit automatically grants the right to carry concealed in Idaho. This assumption is a direct violation of the principle that each state has sovereign authority over firearm regulations within its borders. Relying on an assumption without verifying Idaho's specific laws and reciprocity agreements could lead to a violation of Idaho Code, potentially resulting in criminal charges. Another incorrect approach would be to only rely on information from Montana authorities regarding reciprocity. While Montana authorities may be aware of agreements their state has entered into, the ultimate authority on carrying a concealed weapon within Idaho rests with Idaho's legislature and law enforcement. Information solely from Montana might not be current or comprehensive regarding Idaho's specific requirements or any changes in their reciprocity status. A final incorrect approach would be to carry concealed without any verification, believing that law enforcement in Idaho would be lenient or unaware of the permit status. This demonstrates a disregard for the law and a failure to exercise due diligence. The responsibility for legal compliance rests solely with the individual carrying the firearm. The professional reasoning framework for individuals in this situation should involve a multi-step process. 1. Identify the governing laws of the new jurisdiction Idaho. 2. Research specific reciprocity agreements between the originating state, Montana, and the new state, Idaho. 3. If reciprocity is not explicitly established or is conditional, investigate the process for obtaining a permit or recognition in the new state. 4. Seek official guidance from the relevant authorities in the new state if any ambiguity remains. Question 12. Quality control measures reveal that an applicant for a Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit is relying on their valid concealed weapon permit from their home state and general knowledge of firearms laws in other jurisdictions to complete their application. What is the most appropriate course of action for the applicant to ensure their application meets Montana's specific statutory requirements? Option A. Proceed with the application by only providing proof of their home state permit, believing this exempts them from Montana's specific training and residency verification for non-residents. Option B. Assume that their existing concealed weapon permit from another state automatically satisfies Montana's requirements for non-residents due to reciprocity. Option C. Diligently review Montana Code Annotated Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, focusing on the statutory definition of a non-resident, all enumerated qualifications for permit issuance, and the specific requirements for firearm safety training as mandated for non-resident applicants. Option D. Submit the application with the understanding that general knowledge of concealed carry laws across various states is sufficient for Montana's review process. The correct answer is C. Diligently review Montana Code Annotated Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, focusing on the statutory definition of a non-resident, all enumerated qualifications for permit issuance, and the specific requirements for firearm safety training as mandated for non-resident applicants. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant for a Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit to navigate potentially conflicting information regarding reciprocity and the specific requirements of Montana law. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to Montana's statutory requirements for permit issuance, particularly concerning out-of-state applicants, can lead to denial of the permit and potential legal complications. Careful judgment is required to ensure all statutory prerequisites are met. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves diligently reviewing Montana Code Annotated, MCA Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, specifically the provisions governing concealed weapon permits for non-residents. This entails understanding the statutory definition of a resident and non-resident as defined by Montana law, and ensuring the applicant meets all the enumerated qualifications, such as age, residency in their home state, and absence of disqualifying criminal history or mental health adjudications, as stipulated in MCA 45-8-321. The applicant must also demonstrate they have completed a firearms safety course that meets Montana's statutory requirements, as outlined in MCA 45-8-321-2. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the statutory mandates for permit issuance, ensuring compliance with Montana's specific legal framework for non-resident permits, thereby maximizing the likelihood of a successful application. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on the assumption that a concealed weapon permit from another state automatically grants reciprocity in Montana without verifying Montana's specific statutory requirements for non-residents. This fails to acknowledge that Montana law dictates its own criteria for issuing permits to non-residents, and reciprocity agreements, if any, are subject to Montana's legislative framework. This approach risks overlooking crucial Montana-specific qualifications. Another incorrect approach is to submit an application based on general knowledge of concealed carry laws in other states without confirming the specific documentation and training requirements mandated by Montana law for non-residents. Montana statutes are precise about what constitutes acceptable proof of firearms proficiency and what disqualifies an applicant. Relying on generalized knowledge rather than specific statutory requirements is a significant regulatory failure. A further incorrect approach is to assume that because the applicant possesses a valid concealed weapon permit from their home state, they are automatically exempt from Montana's residency verification or specific training course requirements for non-residents. Montana law, as detailed in MCA 45-8-321, outlines distinct criteria for non-resident applicants, which may include demonstrating residency in their home state and meeting specific training standards, regardless of their existing permit. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making framework that prioritizes statutory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the specific jurisdiction and relevant laws, Montana Code Annotated, Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3. 2. thoroughly researching the statutory requirements for the specific applicant type, non-resident. 3. Verifying all enumerated qualifications and documentation requirements against the applicant's circumstances. 4. Seeking clarification from official Montana state sources if any ambiguity exists regarding statutory interpretation. This methodical approach ensures that decisions are grounded in legal mandates and ethical obligations to uphold the law. Question 13. The monitoring system demonstrates that a Montana resident who is applying for a non-resident concealed weapon permit in Montana has primarily relied on advice from an online firearm enthusiast forum and a conversation with a friend who obtained a permit several years ago to prepare their application. Considering the specific legal framework for Montana non-resident concealed weapon permits, which of the following approaches best reflects professional decision-making and ensures compliance with current Montana law? Option A. Contacting the Sheriff's Department in the applicant's home state to inquire about their understanding of Montana's non-resident permit requirements, believing that out-of-state law enforcement agencies would have up-to-date knowledge. Option B. Proceeding with the application based on the information gathered from the online forum and the friend's advice, assuming that the general principles of concealed carry are consistent across states and that past practices remain valid. Option C. Thoroughly reviewing the current Montana Code annotated and the administrative rules published by the Montana Department of Justice regarding non-resident concealed weapon permits, and confirming the validity and terms of any reciprocity agreements between the applicant's home state and Montana. Option D. Submitting the application with the assumption that a valid concealed weapon permit from the applicant's home state is sufficient for carrying a concealed weapon in Montana, without further investigation into Montana's specific non-resident permit process. The correct answer is C. Thoroughly reviewing the current Montana Code annotated and the administrative rules published by the Montana Department of Justice regarding non-resident concealed weapon permits, and confirming the validity and terms of any reciprocity agreements between the applicant's home state and Montana. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the applicant to navigate the specific requirements for a non-resident concealed weapon permit in Montana, which involves understanding the reciprocity agreements and the legal framework governing firearm possession by out-of-state residents. The applicant's reliance on outdated information and a misunderstanding of current Montana law creates a significant risk of non-compliance, potentially leading to legal repercussions. Careful judgment is required to ensure all application materials and personal circumstances align with the most current Montana statutes and administrative rules. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves meticulously reviewing the current Montana Code annotated, MCA, and the administrative rules promulgated by the Montana Department of Justice concerning concealed weapon permits for non-residents. This includes verifying the existence and terms of any reciprocity agreements between the applicant's home state and Montana, and ensuring all application requirements, such as proof of residency in their home state and any required training, are met according to the most recent legal standards. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the principle of following current statutory law and administrative regulations, which is paramount for legal compliance and successful permit acquisition. The Montana Department of Justice is the authoritative source for this information, and their published guidelines and statutes are the definitive legal requirements. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves relying solely on information from an online forum or a friend's past experience. This is professionally unacceptable because online forums are not official sources of legal information and can contain outdated or inaccurate advice. Personal anecdotes, while well-intentioned, do not reflect the current legal landscape, which can change frequently. This approach risks violating MCA provisions regarding concealed weapon permits due to misinformation. Another incorrect approach is assuming that permit from the applicant's home state automatically grants reciprocal rights in Montana without verifying specific reciprocity agreements. While reciprocity is a factor, Montana law dictates the terms under which non-residents can obtain or exercise concealed weapon privileges. Failing to confirm these specific agreements, as outlined in MCA Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, is a direct failure to comply with the state's specific jurisdictional requirements for non-resident permits. A third incorrect approach is submitting an application without confirming if the applicant meets Montana's residency requirements for a non-resident permit, even if they are a resident of another state. Non-resident permits have specific criteria, and misunderstanding or misrepresenting these can lead to application denial or, if granted erroneously, revocation. This bypasses the fundamental legal prerequisites established by Montana law for such permits. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making framework that prioritizes verification of current legal requirements from official sources. This involves identifying the relevant jurisdiction, Montana, the specific legal area, concealed weapon permits for non-residents, and then consulting the primary legal authorities, Montana Code annotated and administrative rules. Any information obtained from secondary sources, forums, friends, must be cross-referenced and validated against these primary sources before any action is taken. This ensures adherence to the law and avoids potential legal pitfalls. Question 14. System analysis indicates a Montana resident is applying for a non-resident concealed weapon permit in Wyoming. Which of the following actions best demonstrates the applicant's understanding of jurisdiction-specific requirements for obtaining such a permit? Option A. The applicant submits their Montana driver's license as proof of identity and believes this is sufficient without further investigation into Wyoming's specific identification requirements for non-residents. Option B. The applicant assumes that because they hold a valid concealed weapon permit in Montana, Wyoming will automatically recognize it due to reciprocity agreements. Option C. The applicant meticulously reviews the official Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigations website for non-resident permit application procedures, required documentation, and eligibility criteria specific to Wyoming law. Option D. The applicant contacts a friend in Wyoming who has a concealed weapon permit and follows their informal advice on how to apply, without consulting official Wyoming resources. The correct answer is C. The applicant meticulously reviews the official Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigations website for non-resident permit application procedures, required documentation, and eligibility criteria specific to Wyoming law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the specific requirements for a non-resident concealed weapon permit in Montana, a state with its own distinct legal framework. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to these requirements can lead to denial of the permit, potential legal repercussions, and a failure to uphold the integrity of the permitting process. The applicant must demonstrate a clear understanding of Montana's laws regarding firearm possession and concealed carry for individuals who are not residents of the state. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves the applicant meticulously reviewing and adhering to the official Montana Department of Justice's guidelines for non-resident concealed weapon permits. This includes understanding the specific application forms, required documentation, such as proof of residency in their home state, a clean criminal record, and potentially firearm safety training if mandated by Montana law for non-residents. And the submission process. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with Montana Code Annotated (MCA), Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, which governs concealed weapons. Specifically, MCA 45-8-321 outlines the requirements for issuing permits, and the Department of Justice is tasked with establishing the procedures. By following the official guidelines, the applicant ensures they are meeting all statutory and administrative requirements, demonstrating due diligence and respect for Montana's laws. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that the concealed carry laws of the applicant's home state are sufficient for obtaining a Montana permit. This is an ethical and regulatory failure because Montana has its own specific statutes and administrative rules for issuing permits to non-residents. Relying solely on home state reciprocity without verifying Montana's unique requirements can lead to an incomplete or inaccurate application, resulting in denial and a misunderstanding of Montana's sovereign authority to regulate firearm possession within its borders. Another incorrect approach is to submit an application without thoroughly understanding the definition of resident, as it pertains to Montana's concealed weapon permit laws. Montana law may have specific criteria for establishing residency for the purpose of such permits, and an applicant who does not meet these criteria, even if they believe they are a resident of another state, could have their application rejected. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to comply with the specific legal definitions established by Montana. A third incorrect approach is to submit an application that omits or misrepresents information regarding prior criminal history or disqualifying factors as defined by Montana law. MCA 45-8-321 lists several grounds for denial, including certain felony convictions or a history of mental disorders. Failing to disclose or accurately report such information is a direct violation of the application's sworn statements and Montana law, leading to denial and potential legal consequences for providing false information. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding and adhering to the specific legal and regulatory framework of the jurisdiction in question. This involves 1. Identifying the governing jurisdiction and its relevant laws, in this case, Montana Code Annotated. 2. Consulting official government sources for the most current and accurate application procedures and requirements. 3. Thoroughly reviewing all application materials and instructions, paying close attention to definitions and eligibility criteria. 4. Honestly and accurately completing all sections of the application, providing all requested documentation. 5. Seeking clarification from the issuing authority if any aspect of the requirements is unclear. This methodical approach ensures compliance, upholds ethical standards, and maximizes the likelihood of a successful outcome. Question 15. System analysis indicates a Montana resident of Wyoming wishes to obtain a non-resident concealed weapon permit in Montana. Which approach best ensures compliance with Montana's regulatory framework for such permits? Option A. The applicant provides a notarized statement from a Wyoming law enforcement officer confirming their good standing, without consulting Montana's specific application requirements. Option B. The applicant meticulously reviews Montana Code Annotated Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, ensuring they meet all eligibility criteria, and accurately complete the application with all required supporting documentation from their home state. Option C. The applicant assumes their valid Wyoming concealed weapon permit automatically grants them eligibility for a Montana non-resident permit, submitting only that permit as proof of qualification. Option D. The applicant submits an application to Montana without any supporting documentation, believing their Wyoming permit is sufficient and that Montana will verify their status independently. The correct answer is B. The applicant meticulously reviews Montana Code Annotated Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, ensuring they meet all eligibility criteria and accurately complete the application with all required supporting documentation from their home state. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the specific requirements for a non-resident concealed weapon permit in Montana, a process that involves understanding both state-specific statutes and the applicant's home state's laws regarding concealed carry. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to these requirements can lead to denial of the permit, potential legal complications, and a failure to uphold the integrity of the permitting process. The applicant's responsibility is to provide accurate and complete information, and the permitting authority's responsibility is to assess that information against Montana law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves the applicant meticulously reviewing Montana Code Annotated, MCA, Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, specifically focusing on the provisions for non-resident permits. This includes understanding the eligibility criteria, the required documentation, such as proof of residency in their home state and a valid permit from their home state if applicable, and the application process itself. The applicant must then accurately complete the Montana application, attesting to their compliance with all stated requirements and truthfully answering all questions. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal framework governing non-resident permits in Montana, ensuring all statutory obligations are met, and that the application is processed according to MCA. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be for the applicant to assume that their concealed weapon permit from their home state automatically qualifies them for a Montana non-resident permit, without verifying Montana's specific requirements. This fails to acknowledge that Montana has its own set of laws and regulations that must be satisfied independently, regardless of reciprocity agreements or existing permits. This approach risks violating MCA provisions by not fulfilling all necessary criteria. Another incorrect approach is to submit an incomplete application, omitting details about their home state's licensing, or failing to provide required supporting documents. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for the procedural requirements outlined in MCA. Such omissions can lead to immediate denial and may require a complete reapplication, delaying the process and potentially raising questions about the applicant's commitment to compliance. A third incorrect approach would be to misrepresent information on the application, such as falsely claiming to meet residency requirements or omitting relevant criminal history that might disqualify them under MCA. This is not only a violation of the statutory requirements for truthfulness in applications, but also constitutes a serious ethical and legal breach, potentially leading to severe penalties beyond permit denial. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a structured decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and accuracy. This involves 1. Identifying the governing jurisdiction and its specific laws, Montana Code Annotated, Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3 for non-resident permits. 2. Thoroughly researching and understanding all eligibility criteria, application procedures, and required documentation. 3. Accurately and truthfully completing all sections of the application, cross-referencing information with supporting documents. 4. Seeking clarification from the issuing authority if any aspect of the requirements is unclear. This systematic approach ensures that all legal and procedural obligations are met, leading to a successful and compliant outcome. Question 16. The assessment process reveals that a Montana resident who holds a valid Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit is planning a road trip through several states. Before departing, the individual needs to determine if and where they can legally carry their concealed firearm. Which of the following actions represents the most responsible and legally sound approach to ensure compliance with concealed carry laws in the states they will be traveling through? Option A. Rely on advice from fellow travelers or online forums that discuss concealed carry laws and reciprocity between states. Option B. Assume that a valid Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit is recognized in all other states, allowing for concealed carry without further investigation. Option C. Proactively research and confirm the specific reciprocity agreements between Montana and each state on their travel itinerary by consulting official state government websites or the respective state's Attorney General's office. Option D. Carry the concealed weapon without verifying reciprocity, planning to disarm or seek legal counsel only if questioned by law enforcement. The correct answer is C. Proactively research and confirm the specific reciprocity agreements between Montana and each state on their travel itinerary by consulting official state government websites or the respective state's Attorney General's office. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario where a Montana resident, seeking to carry a concealed weapon in another state, must navigate the complexities of reciprocity agreements. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires an understanding of how Montana's permit interacts with the laws of other jurisdictions, specifically concerning concealed carry. Misinterpreting these agreements can lead to serious legal consequences, including arrest and prosecution for unlawful carrying of a weapon. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with both Montana law and the laws of the state where the individual intends to carry. Correct approach involves proactively researching and confirming the specific reciprocity agreements between Montana and the destination state. This means consulting official sources such as the Montana Department of Justice, the Attorney General's office of the destination state, or reputable legal resources that track reciprocity. This approach is correct because Montana law, while granting a permit, does not unilaterally dictate how that permit is recognized elsewhere. Reciprocity is a matter of mutual agreement between states. Adhering to this approach ensures the individual is acting within the legal framework of both jurisdictions, thereby avoiding any violation of concealed carry laws. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a valid Montana concealed weapon permit automatically grants the right to carry concealed in any other state. This assumption is flawed because reciprocity is not universal and depends on specific agreements. Relying on this assumption could lead to carrying a concealed weapon in a state that does not recognize Montana permits, resulting in a violation of that state's laws. Another incorrect approach is to rely on informal advice from friends or online forums regarding reciprocity. While well-intentioned, such advice is often inaccurate, outdated, or incomplete. Laws and agreements can change, and informal sources are not authoritative. Basing a decision on such advice carries a significant risk of legal repercussions. A further incorrect approach would be to carry the weapon concealed without verifying reciprocity, intending to deal with it if questioned. This demonstrates a disregard for the law and a failure to exercise due diligence. The legal consequences of being caught carrying unlawfully are severe and can include fines, imprisonment, and the revocation of the Montana permit. The professional reasoning framework for such situations involves a multi-step decision-making process. 1. Identify the core legal requirement, understanding the need to comply with the laws of the jurisdiction where the action, carrying a concealed weapon, will take place. 2. Information gathering, actively seeking out official and reliable information regarding reciprocity agreements. This includes consulting state government websites, official legal databases, and relevant law enforcement agencies. 3. Verification, cross-referencing information from multiple reputable sources to ensure accuracy and currency. 4. Risk assessment, evaluating the potential legal consequences of noncompliance. 5. Action based on verified information, proceeding only after confirming that the intended action is legally permissible in the destination state. Question 17. The audit findings indicate a potential misinterpretation of Montana's requirements for issuing a concealed weapon permit to a non-resident applicant who presented a valid permit from their home state. Which of the following approaches best reflects sound professional judgment and adherence to Montana law? Option A. Assume that a valid concealed weapon permit from another state automatically grants the holder the right to carry concealed in Montana, as long as the applicant appears to be in good standing in their home state. Option B. Verify the specific requirements for non-resident concealed weapon permits under the Montana Code annotated, including any reciprocity agreements or specific application processes for out-of-state applicants, before proceeding with the permit issuance. Option C. Issue the permit based on the applicant's home state permit, prioritizing a quick and efficient process to avoid delays for the applicant. Option D. Rely on general advice found on firearm enthusiast forums or from colleagues regarding the validity of out-of-state permits for concealed carry in Montana. The correct answer is B. Verify the specific requirements for non-resident concealed weapon permits under the Montana Code annotated, including any reciprocity agreements or specific application processes for out-of-state applicants, before proceeding with the permit issuance. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential lapse in judgment regarding the interpretation of Montana's non-resident concealed weapon permit requirements. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of state-specific firearm laws, which can have significant legal and safety implications. Misinterpreting these laws can lead to serious consequences for both the permit holder and the issuing authority. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance and uphold public safety. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the Montana Code annotated (MCA), specifically addressing the requirements for non-resident concealed weapon permits, including any reciprocity agreements or specific conditions that apply. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the governing statutes and regulations of Montana. Montana law, as outlined in MCA Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, governs the carrying of concealed weapons. For non-residents, this typically involves understanding if Montana recognizes permits issued by other states, or if a separate Montana permit is required, and what the application process and qualifications entail for out-of-state applicants. Relying on official state statutes ensures that decisions are based on the legally binding framework, preventing potential violations. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on informal advice from a peer, or a general online forum discussion. This is professionally unacceptable because such sources are not authoritative and may be outdated, inaccurate, or misinterpretations of the law. This could lead to a violation of MCA Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, by assuming a permit is valid when it is not, or by failing to meet specific Montana requirements for non-residents. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because a permit is valid in the applicant's home state, it automatically grants concealed carry privileges in Montana without further verification. This is a failure to comply with Montana's specific statutory requirements for non-residents, as outlined in the MCA. Montana law may have distinct provisions for non-residents that differ from their home state's regulations, and failing to investigate these specific provisions is a regulatory failure. A third incorrect approach would be to prioritize expediency over accuracy by issuing a permit based on a quick glance at a neighboring state's permit, without confirming Montana's specific non-resident requirements. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the legal framework governing concealed weapon permits in Montana, potentially leading to the issuance of a permit to an individual who does not meet the state's criteria, thereby compromising public safety and violating MCA Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes consulting official, jurisdiction-specific legal resources. This involves identifying the relevant statutes and regulations, in this case, Montana Code Annotated, seeking clarification from legal counsel or the relevant state agency if ambiguity exists, and documenting the research and decision-making process. This systematic approach ensures compliance, upholds ethical standards, and protects both the individual and the public. Question 18. Operational review demonstrates an applicant for a Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit has provided documentation of a valid concealed weapon permit from their home state, which is not Montana. What is the most appropriate next step for the licensing authority to ensure compliance with Montana law? Option A. Advise the applicant that their out-of-state permit is generally sufficient and proceed with the application process without further verification of Montana-specific requirements. Option B. Inform the applicant that Montana does not recognize concealed weapon permits from any other state and deny the application outright. Option C. Verify if Montana has a reciprocity agreement with the applicant's home state and review Montana's specific statutes and administrative rules regarding non-resident concealed weapon permits to determine if the applicant meets all eligibility criteria. Option D. Accept the out-of-state permit as sufficient proof of eligibility and proceed with issuing the Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit. Correct answer is C. Verify if Montana has a reciprocity agreement with the applicant's home state and review Montana's specific statutes and administrative rules regarding non-resident concealed weapon permits to determine if the applicant meets all eligibility criteria. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the applicant to navigate the specific requirements for non-resident concealed weapon permits in Montana, which involves understanding the reciprocity agreements and the legal framework governing firearm possession by out-of-state residents. Misinterpreting these requirements can lead to denial of the permit, potential legal issues, and a failure to uphold the integrity of the permitting process. Careful judgment is required to ensure all conditions are met accurately and ethically. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves thoroughly researching Montana's specific statutes and administrative rules pertaining to non-resident concealed weapon permits, paying close attention to any reciprocity agreements with the applicant's home state. This approach ensures that the applicant is providing accurate information and meeting all legal prerequisites for the permit. Montana Code Annotated, MCA, Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, outlines the requirements for concealed weapon permits and understanding how these apply to non-residents, including any specific documentation or training requirements, is paramount. This aligns with the ethical obligation to process applications fairly and according to established law. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that a concealed weapon permit from another state automatically grants the same rights in Montana without verifying specific reciprocity. Montana law dictates the conditions under which non-residents can obtain or carry concealed weapons, and simply possessing a permit from another jurisdiction does not bypass these requirements. This failure to verify specific Montana statutes and reciprocity agreements constitutes a regulatory failure. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on general information about firearm laws without consulting Montana's specific legal framework. General knowledge is insufficient when dealing with the precise legal requirements of a particular jurisdiction. This can lead to the submission of incomplete or incorrect applications, violating the specific mandates of Montana's concealed weapon permit laws. A further incorrect approach is to advise the applicant based on anecdotal evidence or personal experience without confirming current Montana statutes and administrative rules. Laws and regulations can change, and relying on outdated or unverified information is a significant ethical and regulatory lapse. This can result in providing misleading advice, potentially leading the applicant to violate Montana law. Professional reasoning. professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and accurate information gathering. This involves 1. Identifying the specific jurisdiction and the relevant legal framework, Montana Code annotated. 2. Determining the applicant's status, non-resident, and the specific permit type, concealed weapon. 3. Researching all applicable statutes, administrative rules, and reciprocity agreements. 4. Verifying all information with official sources. 5. Providing advice and processing applications strictly in accordance with the verified legal requirements. Question 19. The evaluation methodology shows that a Montana non-resident applicant for a concealed weapon permit has disclosed a prior arrest for a misdemeanor offense that resulted in a dismissal. What is the most appropriate course of action for the permit issuing authority in Montana? Option A. Automatically deny the permit application due to the presence of an arrest record, regardless of the dismissal. Option B. Request additional documentation from the applicant without verifying the disposition of the arrest or the nature of the underlying offense. Option C. Approve the permit application immediately, assuming a dismissal negates any potential risk. Option D. Conduct a thorough investigation into the disposition of the misdemeanor arrest and evaluate the underlying offense against the disqualifying criteria outlined in Montana Code Annotated Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3 before making a decision. Correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough investigation into the disposition of the misdemeanor arrest and evaluate the underlying offense against the disqualifying criteria outlined in Montana Code Annotated Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, before making a decision. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that processing a Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit application requires a meticulous adherence to state statutes and a thorough understanding of the applicant's background. The professional challenge lies in balancing the applicant's right to self-defense with the state's compelling interest in public safety. This scenario is challenging because the applicant has a prior arrest for a misdemeanor that was dismissed, which requires careful interpretation under Montana law to determine if it disqualifies them. A superficial review could lead to an incorrect denial or approval, with significant legal and ethical ramifications. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of all submitted documentation, including the applicant's criminal history, and a precise application of Montana Code Annotated, MCA Title 45, Chapter 8, Part 3, which governs concealed weapon permits. Specifically, MCA 45-8-321 outlines the criteria for permit issuance and denial. A dismissed misdemeanor arrest, while noted, does not automatically disqualify an applicant unless the underlying offense would have been a felony or a crime involving violence. The permit officer must verify the disposition of the arrest and confirm that no conviction resulted from it, and that the offense itself does not fall under disqualifying categories as defined by MCA 45-8-321. This approach ensures compliance with Montana law, upholds due process for the applicant, and prioritizes public safety by applying the statutory criteria accurately. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the permit based solely on the existence of an arrest record, regardless of its disposition. This fails to recognize that Montana law distinguishes between arrests and convictions, and that dismissed charges do not equate to guilt. Such an action would violate the applicant's rights and potentially expose the state to legal challenges for wrongful denial. Another incorrect approach would be to approve the permit without thoroughly investigating the nature of the dismissed misdemeanor. If the underlying offense, even if dismissed, was a disqualifying offense under MCA 45-8-321E, G, domestic violence, assault, approving the permit would create a public safety risk and violate the spirit and letter of the law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes statutory compliance, thorough investigation, and objective assessment. This involves 1. Understanding the specific legal requirements of Montana's concealed weapon permit statutes. 2. Conducting a complete background check, including verifying the disposition of any arrests. 3. Evaluating the nature of any offenses, even if dismissed, against the disqualifying criteria outlined in MCA 45-8-321. 4. Documenting the decision-making process meticulously, including the rationale for approval or denial based on the statutory framework. Question 20. System analysis indicates a Montana non-resident concealed weapon permit holder is planning for their permit renewal, which is valid for 5 years. The current statutory renewal fee, as stipulated by Montana Code Annotated Section 45-3-315, is $50. If the permit holder wishes to accurately budget for the renewal cost at the end of the 5-year period, what is the precise amount they should set aside? Option A, $45. Option B, $50. Option C, $250. Option D, $10. The correct answer is B, $50. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Montana concealed weapon permit applicant by requiring them to accurately calculate the potential financial implications of a permit renewal based on fluctuating state fees. The challenge lies in ensuring the applicant understands the financial commitment and can correctly project future costs, which is crucial for responsible permit management and avoiding lapses in legal carry status due to financial oversight. Accurate calculation is paramount, as miscalculations could lead to unexpected expenses or a failure to renew on time, potentially impacting their legal right to carry. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a direct calculation of the renewal fee based on the current statutory rate and the remaining validity period of the permit. This approach is correct because Montana law, specifically Montana Code Annotated, MCA, Section 45-3-315, outlines the non-resident concealed weapon permit renewal fee. The statute specifies a fixed fee for renewal. Therefore, the most accurate and legally compliant method is to apply this statutory fee directly to the renewal process. This ensures the applicant is prepared for the exact financial obligation as defined by state law. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves averaging past renewal fees. This is flawed because state fees can change over time due to legislative action or administrative rule changes. Relying on historical averages would not account for potential increases or decreases in the current statutory fee, leading to an inaccurate financial projection and potentially insufficient funds for renewal. Another incorrect approach is to estimate the fee based on a percentage of the initial application fee. This is problematic because the renewal fee is a distinct statutory amount, not necessarily a direct percentage of the initial fee. MCA Section 45-3-315 clearly defines the renewal fee independently. Using a percentage-based estimation ignores the specific legislative mandate for the renewal cost. A further incorrect approach is to simply assume the fee will remain the same as the previous renewal. This is a risky assumption, as it fails to acknowledge the possibility of statutory fee adjustments. Professional responsibility requires accounting for potential changes in fees as dictated by state law, rather than relying on past figures without verification. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes accuracy and adherence to statutory requirements. This involves 1. Identifying the specific legal requirement, Montana's non-resident concealed weapon permit renewal fee. 2. Consulting the definitive source of information, Montana Code Annotated, specifically Section 45-3-315. 3. Performing a direct calculation based on the current statutory fee. 4. Verifying the calculation against the law. This systematic approach ensures compliance and provides the applicant with reliable financial information.